In the forgotten folds of time, long before the stars whispered their first lullabies to the night and the moon found her place in the sky, there existed a hidden continent, veiled in clouds and guarded by winds that remembered the old songs. A land called Illyriath, where gods and mortals coexisted not in fear, but in the trembling silence of reverence and yearning. For it was here that time itself flowed like a quiet river through the mountains of mist and forests, so vast they sang to themselves in languages older than light. And in this land, far beyond the reach of the waking world, lived a woman named Thalea, not born, but dreamed into existence by the last breath of the slumbering earth goddess Elaris, who before surrendering to her centuries-long sleep, molded Thalea from the shimmer of twilight and gave her the gift of dream weaving, a sacred art that allowed her to enter the slumber of others and guide them through realms of memory, healing, and forgotten longing. She lived alone in a towering sanctuary carved into the roots of the Silver Mountains, a place known as the Hollow of Stillness, surrounded by sapphire-leaved trees whose branches dripped with slow glowing light, and moonberries said to bloom only when someone whispered a secret to the wind. And every night, Thalea would close her eyes, lie upon the moss-covered altar at the heart of her hollow, and breathe herself into the dreams of others. Kings twisted by guilt, widows mourning memories that flickered like candlelight, wandering children with stars in their eyes, and even old gods whose names were lost to time, but whose hearts still ached with the gravity of eternity. She would find them all, wrap them in stories, and sing to their sorrow until it unraveled like dew in the dawn. And it was during one of these descents that she felt a disturbance, a dream unlike any she had touched before, a hollow place not born of grief, but of pure silence, a dream that did not open but swallowed, a dream that looked back, and in this void she heard the whisper of a name that no dreamweaver should ever hear. Near, the sleeper, beneath the sea, a forgotten deity whose body had been sealed beneath the obsidian tides when the sky was still learning to hold the sun, a being so ancient that even the myths of his myths had turned to dust. But somehow, his dreams had begun to bleed upward into the world of men, carried like spores on the breath of sleeping fishers and moon-bathed widows, dreams full of dark coral cities and oceans that hung upside down. And Thalea, moved by both terror and duty, wove herself into these dreams, night after night, searching for the heart of the silence, the eye of the storm. And with each descent, she felt herself unraveling, her voice growing softer, her memories dimmer, until she found herself standing beneath the sea, in a dream that tasted of salt and rust and old lullabies, where great spires of coral pulsed like living hearts, and shadows flickered like forgotten numb. And so, as the last ripple of moonlight faded from the sacred pool, where the goddess Ilarion once whispered her fate to the chosen, the world beyond the veil of Siren began to churn with unseen forces awakening, the echoes of the oracle's prophecy still humming in the marrow of the earth, where the ancient roots of the world tree twisted in silence. Beneath the glimmering boughs of that eternal tree, where time folded in on itself and memory mingled with destiny. The air thickened as a shadow moved across the moss-covered stones, a being cloaked not in darkness but in memory itself, shaped by forgotten oaths and betrayed promises. An ancient guardian once cast from the circle of flame for a love that defied the divine order, and now summoned again by the pulse of something older than gods, older than stars, older even than the first utterance of creation's name. And as the stars realigned with agonizing slowness above the twilight skies of Eldarion, the continent where mortal and myth once danced in reckless abandon, the high priestess of the fallen moon cult, Anthera, flame-eyed and silver-veined, opened her arms to the wind that now carried a name only the oldest scrolls dared whisper: Nyros, the forgotten heir, whose bloodline bore both the fire of the Makers and the hunger of the banished ones, and whose return was promised in every eclipse, every thunderclap over the valley of singing bones. And now, in the dusky grove where the dreaming owls never ceased their mournful cries, Nyros stirred, breath ragged, eyes clouded with a storm of images not his own, remembering battles he never fought, lovers he never touched, and a voice, always that same voice, urging him onward into the spiral of prophecy, where identity was merely a garment worn briefly before being cast into the flames of purpose. And as he stepped forth from the cocoon of roots and whispering vines that had nurtured his slumber for 900 years, the world, sensing his arrival, shivered at the edges of reality, and things long sealed behind glass temples and iron incantations began to press against their prisons, clawing at the thin veneer of peace the ancients had maintained with sacred blood and sacrifice. While far to the south, in the city of Marthis, built upon the petrified skeleton of a giant slain during the first sundering, the marble floors of the inner sanctum cracked as the crystal loom, centerpiece of the oracular spire, began to fracture. Its threads, each representing a soul born of destiny, twisting violently as Nyros' strand burned white-hot and tangled itself into thousands of others, binding them to him, rewriting the fate map of the known world, while the loom's guardian, a blind child called Whisper, who spoke only in wind sounds and painted the future in tears, fell into a trance and muttered a single word in a forgotten dialect. He comes. And across the lands, from frost-bitten peaks of Uldrenhall to the wine-scented jungles of Tarvak, fires dimmed, animals stilled, and silence bloomed like nightshade, for the world had begun to remember what it had tried to forget, that not all gods were born in light, and not all heroes were born to save. And as Nyros wandered through the ruins of a temple once dedicated to him, its statues overgrown, its altars cracked, its worship long outlawed by decree of the threefold throne, he felt the call deepen, dragging him toward the convergence, the place where all realms bled into one another every 1,000 years, where the veil thinned to transparency, and creatures from beyond could reach through with thoughts alone, where Elarian, goddess of twilight, had once touched him beneath the tree of echoes and whispered a promise into his bones. When the world forgets, I will remember. When the stars go silent, I will call. And now, that call had become a roar in his soul, pulling him toward the mountain of Soltharkai, whose peak no one living had seen. For it was said that those who reached it did not descend, not because they perished, but because they became something else, something elemental, ancient, reshaped by the primal truths buried in the molten veins of the earth. And Nyros, with every step forward, began to feel his name crumble behind him like dried parchment, until he was no longer a man, no longer a myth, but a current, a force, a spark caught between prophecy and power, while the old enemies who once sealed him away began to stir in alarm, sensing the return of a variable they had buried in prophecy and denied in prayer. And among them was the shard queen Velkara, whose heart was a crystal shard embedded with the names of every soul she had unmade, and who now awoke in her obsidian tomb, eyes blinking like furnace coals, her laughter cracking the stones around her as she whispered to her dead lovers, "He wakes, he walks, he remembers." And her armies of glass-blooded war priests began to gather beneath the dead sky, summoning the winds of war once more. And so as Nyros stood before the mirror marsh, the still waters glistening like liquefied moonlight poured over forgotten truths, the air thick with a silence that had teeth, he gazed at his reflection, crowned in fire, cloaked in silence, and bearing the storm-laden eyes of one who had seen too far, and knew in the marrow of his resurrected bones that the path forward would not simply require strength or cunning or magic, but the brutal sacrifice of identity itself. For the marsh did not merely reflect the form of the traveler, but the unresolved threads of their past, their sins, their secrets, and their futures stitched into shimmering agony. And it was there, beneath a fractured sky, where stars trembled like candle flames in a storm, that he heard again the voice of Lorien, once his sworn brother, once his shadow, once his greatest betrayer, who now stood barefoot in the shallows, his face lined by age and sorrow and sunken hopes, holding in one trembling hand the last phoenix feather, and in the other the blade once called memory, forged in the heart of a dying star, and quenched in Neros's own blood in another age when the world still bled myth like morning dew. And Lorien's voice was cracked and tired, but heavy with knowing, as he said, "You came too late, brother. The echo gates are failing. Velkara rides the winds of the east again, and the threads are snapping." And with that, he tossed the feather into the marsh, where it burst into fire without flame, leaving behind the image of the past, of them both, young and burning with hope, standing atop the sun-spire swearing oaths before the celestial court, then fading into mist. And Nyros stepped forward, his boots sinking into ancient silt where dreams had drowned, and grasped Lorien's forearm in that old warrior's clasp, feeling for the first time in centuries the weight of shared history. And yet even as they reunited, the marsh began to ripple unnaturally, and a shape, too large, too quiet, moved beneath the water. And the trees along the edge of the swamp bent backward in reverence or fear as the air grew still and thick with the scent of memory decaying. And from the water rose a woman not entirely of flesh, her body woven from mist, moss, and sorrow, eyes like hollow lanterns flickering with forgotten names. And she said, "Two sons of the flame return, yet only one walks forward." And she reached out a hand webbed with time and touched Nyros's chest, where his heart beat now, in two rhythms. The rhythm of the world that had slept with him, and the rhythm of what was coming. And she whispered, "The third key lies beneath the city of masks, but beware, the Dream Eater hunts again." And then she crumbled into mist, leaving behind a single blue flame that floated upward and vanished into the sky. And Lorien nodded solemnly, already turning, already walking, as though he had waited a lifetime for that one message. And Nyros followed, and thus began their journey west, through the ghost-ridden woodlands of Theralun, where trees sang dirges in languages no longer spoken, and shadows moved against the grain of light, and for 13 nights they did not speak, but walked together as they once had, side by side, the bond of shared betrayal stronger than any spoken vow, until they reached the edge of the shivering plains, where wind never stopped, and bones of long-dead titans lay half-buried in the ice like forgotten altars. And there they met the first of the three trials foretold by the star monk centuries ago, when the constellation of the waking serpent reappeared after a 1,000-year absence. The trial of truth, which came not as a beast or riddle, but as a child, barefoot, silent, eyes filled with mirrored versions of their own sins, holding in one hand a dagger made of starlight, and in the other a mirror that reflected not what they were, but what they feared to become. And the child said nothing, simply stood there, trembling in the cold. And as Nyros stepped forward, the mirror flickered with an image of him, seated upon a throne of ash and bone, Lorien at his feet, a crown forged of screams upon his head, and 1,000 cities burning in the distance. And he staggered back, as if struck, and the child pointed the dagger at his heart, then dropped both objects into the snow and vanished into the wind. And Lorien picked up the dagger, inspecting it, murmuring, "It's begun. She's testing your will already." And Nyros took the mirror, though its surface had now gone dark, and carried it without understanding why. And they continued, reaching by the 7th week the forgotten pass of Barrow Deep, where the bones of the sky giants still whispered in the wind. And there they were met by the pale host, the army of half-lost souls bound to the last light keeper, who had long since perished in solitude, and who now offered a pact: return the shattered horn of the Seraph King from the City of Masks, and they would lend their memory to Nyros in the coming war. And as Nyros and Lorien stepped deeper into the shifting, hallucinatory sprawl of the City of Masks, where every shadow whispered a forgotten name and every building pulsed faintly as though it breathed the regrets of centuries, the weight of forgotten truths pressed against their skin like invisible armor, and even the air tasted of iron and memory. For this city was no mere relic of civilization, but a living echo of every identity, ever worn and lost, built upon layers of deceit and persona, 1,000 lives overlapping in a dance of masks, too long worn to be removed without pain. And above them loomed the Tower of Etharn, spiraling endlessly upward, yet bending space in such a way that no two gazes beheld the same structure, its walls flowing like water, and then snapping rigid like obsidian with each passing heartbeat. And as they walked through the street of faces, where the masks of all who had entered the city without returning lined the walls, watching silently, eternally, weary illusions began to tug at their minds. Subtle at first, Lorien saw the laughing face of his long-dead daughter reflected in a cracked mirror window, and staggered, whispering her name under his breath, while Nyros heard the voice of his mother calling from behind a curtain of cascading ivy, though she had died in flame 1,000 years before. And with every step they took, more of their past peeled away from the stones, haunting them not with monsters, but with the temptation to forget their mission, to surrender into the comfort of false closure. And yet they pressed on, boots echoing like heartbeats against cobblestone shaped from broken memories, until they reached the Bridge of Doubleday, a structure that stretched across an abyss, not of stone, but of time itself, the void below filled with echoes of moments they had never lived. Nyros saw himself as a healer in a quiet village, unscarred and smiling beside a faceless woman, and Lorien as a poet beneath a tree of light, writing verses to gods who listened. And the bridge demanded a toll, not of gold, but of relinquishment. And so Nairos, heart tight with grief, cast into the abyss the shard of cloth that still bore the blood of his first love. And Lorien, tears streaking his dust-streaked face, let fall the broken tooth of the beast that had killed his brother. And the bridge accepted their offerings and allowed them to pass. But Nairos felt something within him loosen, a tether to a version of himself that had died quietly. And as they crossed, a strange, rhythmic chant began to fill the city, the sound of countless masked voices humming in unison, building a harmony of confusion and prophecy. And they arrived at the square of still faces, a place where motion ceased and the wind stood still, and in its center stood the masked keeper, neither man nor spirit, but a fusion of thousands of identities that had once worn masks so long they forgot their original names, its body constantly reshaping. Woman's smile, warrior's eyes, child's posture, crone's voice, and it regarded Nairos with all the weight of 1,000 stolen pasts, and said, "You wear no mask, yet you have worn many, and forgotten more than most." And the ground trembled with the weight of the truth, for Nairos had in ages past worn the mask of Godslayer, of reconciler, of betrayer, of king uncrowned, and even now he bore within him the dormant fire of the celestial forge, unseen but smouldering behind every step. And the mask keeper raised a finger made of many hands and asked a question that struck like thunder within his soul. Will you become who you must, even if it means ceasing to be who you are? And behind the mask keeper rose the shattered horn of the Seraph King, glowing faintly, each shard pulsing with locked potential, guarded not by force but by the consequence of claiming it. For to reforge it, one must offer an identity into the ether, a part of themselves irreversibly unmade. And Lorien turned to Nairos, hand tightening around the starlight dagger they had taken in the shivering plains, and whispered, "She's watching. Velkara moves." And above them, storm clouds began to form unnaturally fast, swirling with golden lightning and violet flame. And the mask keeper stepped aside without resistance, and Nairos approached the horn, and memories flooded him. Not images, but feelings, entire lives condensed into seconds, until he stood breathless before the relic, reached out, and touched it. And in that instant, he was pulled inward. His soul split into the 8 reflections of his mythic core: the fireborn, the betrayer, the healer, the child, the general, the lover, the mourner, and the king who was promised. But only one could remain, and each screamed in his mind, each demanded to be the truth. And Nairos, in a moment of clarity forged not from power, but from profound loss, chose the mourner, casting the others into the void. And his body shuddered, the flames in his veins flickering, his bones realigning. And when he awoke, and the skies above the city of masks tore like parchment soaked in fire as Velkara descended, her form vast enough to blot out constellations, her wings flaring with the agony of forgotten epochs, each scale across her serpentine body etched with the glyphs of ancient betrayals. Her voice no longer a sound, but a force that bent time itself, and the city quaked in her presence, buildings groaning as if begging for oblivion, while the countless masks adorning every surface screamed in a chorus of memories. And as Nairos raised the reforged horn of the Seraph King, it began to pulse in harmony with the dying heartbeat of the world, its note deep and sorrowful, carrying in its resonance the mourning of civilizations long turned to ash. For this was no mere relic. It was the last remnant of the first dream, the power that once tethered gods to mortality and men to myth. And Velkara, queen of the unseen and mother of untruths, glared down at Nyros with eyes like collapsing stars, and hissed, "You broke the seal that kept truth asleep." And in that moment, the storm she carried unleashed itself, not as rain, but as a rain of lost souls, billions of drifting visages howling as they fell from the heavens like ash, clawing at the air, desperate to return to the flesh they had long since lost. And the ground cracked as her children surged forward, beasts of nightmare and negation, each one bearing a name that had been stolen from time. Oithron, devourer of echoes; Calyx, the sighing maw; Vailmur, the mirror wolf. And as they emerged, Lorien took a stance only a few living beings remembered, his blade memory gleaming with the tears of gods, and whispered the invocation of the sundered wind, unleashing a gust that cleaved the charging shadow beasts in twain. But more rose in their place, for Velkara's power was not creation, but duplication. Every fear they conquered, she multiplied; every lie they denied, she amplified. And Nyros, breathing fire from between cracked ribs, blew the horn, and the notes shattered the illusion of sky itself, revealing the pale host. Those who had died unremembered, those who had faded from myth, awakening from stasis in their alabaster tombs in the void between stars. Each a soldier who had once dared to dream, each rising with hollow eyes but burning purpose. Their ghost steeds galloping upon trails of starlight, descending upon the city like a flood of vengeance. And Velkara roared, striking the ground with her tail, and tearing a canyon through time, into which past and present began to fall, collapsing into paradox. But Nyros leapt across the gap, fire spiraling from his hands, and struck her scaled head with a blow that ignited a forgotten sun above them, staggering her for only a moment. And in that moment, Lorien plunged memory into the earth, unleashing a shockwave of recollection. Everyone in the city remembered who they truly were. Every mask fell, every lie crumbled, and the city wept as its illusions were laid bare, revealing not a glorious metropolis, but a ruin built atop bones and shame. And the mask keeper, no longer shifting, now stood in its true form, a weeping child crowned with thorns, who whispered, I remember my name." And with that, it vanished into light, granting Lorien the final truth blade, remembrance. And now armed with both memory and remembrance, he joined Nyros in confronting Velkara, who writhed and twisted, her true form no longer stable, now bleeding myth and fire. And she howled, "I was born from your desire to forget. I am your mercy." And Nyros replied, voice calm and fierce, "And we no longer need mercy. We need truth." And with that, he blew the horn a second time, longer, deeper, and the pale host circled above, then dove into Velkara's form like meteors, exploding within her with incandescent fury, their essence unweaving the tapestry of her being thread by mythic thread. And in her final moment, she looked not at Nyros or Lorien, but at the shattered city, and whispered, "You will regret remembering." And then she was gone, unraveling into a storm of fading thoughts, and silence fell, a deep, aching silence filled with the absence of illusions. And Nyros fell to his knees, the horn crumbling in his hands, its purpose fulfilled. And Lorien sat beside him, bleeding from a dozen wounds, looking at the scorched skyline and the sky now clear of deception, and asked, "What now?" And from the ashes of Velkara's fall, a single seed grew, a tree, silver-barked and golden-leaved, the tree of the first word, said to bloom only when the world is ready to speak its truth again, and its branches stretched slowly into the sky, touching the broken clouds, healing them. And as it did, Nyros heard a voice in his mind, not Velkara's, but the one she had hidden all this time. The voice of Elenai, the first flame, the god whose name had been forgotten, now stirring in the roots of the world, whispering, "Thank you, mourner. Now the stars will weep no more." And so, Nyros and Lorien walked from the smoldering remnants of the city of masks, the ashes of Velkara swirling behind them like a vanishing storm, their steps slow but sure as they descended into the basin that legends called the Shattered Valley, a place spoken of only in broken prayers and unintentional whispers. For it was not a valley as mortals knew valleys, but a fracture in reality itself, where time had once been struck by something it could not withstand. Perhaps the hand of a mad god, or perhaps the will of the world itself rebelling against its destiny. And now the land bore that trauma like a wound too deep to scab. For the sky here moved in reverse, while the rivers flowed sideways through air, and moments repeated or vanished at random. The bones of titans tangled with the roots of trees that grew downward into stars instead of upward into soil. And Nyros felt the pull of every memory he'd tried to bury, clawing at the edges of his mind, while Lorien clutched the twin truth blades, memory and remembrance, each pulsing not with power but with purpose, as if they too remembered where they had been forged and what they must now face. And as they entered the valley's distorted core, they were met by a being draped in broken hours, its face a spinning wheel of forgotten days, its voice like sand spilling upward, calling itself Orinex the Chrono Warden, guardian of the splintered tapestry, who warned them that beyond this place lay the domain of the first waking god, who stirred now, not in slumber, but in confusion. For the fall of Velkara had broken the spell of forgetfulness, and now the gods who had once ruled from within silence were beginning to murmur. And one among them, Ulthamar, the god of certainty, was opening his third eye in the great void beneath the valley. And certainty, like death, tolerated no rival. And so to cross the valley, they had to relinquish all doubt. For doubt was what protected them from becoming echoes of themselves. And Nyros, gritting his teeth, dropped his sword into the river of reversed flame and watched it unforge itself, returning to the moment it had been mined from the bones of a volcano dragon. While Lorien stared into the sky, where his childhood played out backward, and finally whispered the one truth he had never dared speak aloud. "I once loved Velkara." And the sky shuddered, wept, and then healed. And they passed through into the heart of the valley, where the heartbeat of Ulthamar pulsed through the stone like thunder through the bones of giants. And there, beneath a mountain that slept upside down in the air above them, was the altar of the first judgment, where the voice of Ulthamar rumbled, not as sound, but as law, absolute, infallible, and terrifying. For it declared, "There shall be no more questions." And reality trembled as the trees bowed in obedience, and the air itself stilled, and Nyros stumbled, clutching his head, as every uncertainty he had ever cherished was ripped from him. Would they win? Could truth survive? Was he worthy? And Lorien screamed as remembrance shattered into a storm of golden shards, revealing that it was never a blade, but a promise held together by belief. And now belief was dying, for Ulthamar's presence made all things certain, and certainty is the death of change, and change is the soul of life. And as the god began to rise, not as a shape, but as a system of reality rewriting itself, turning every atom into a declaration. Nyros did the unthinkable. He laughed, not in mockery, but in rebellion, in the way fire laughs when it is denied fuel, in the way wind laughs when faced with walls. And from his laughter, a new sound was born, a note not of remembrance, but of possibility. And though the horn of the seraph king had crumbled, the memory of its sound remained, etched into the marrow of Nyros's soul. And he sang that note now, his voice cracking and bleeding, yet pure. And the note disrupted Ulthamar's perfection. For in the sound was a question, and Ulthamar, bound to the law of certainty, could not answer a question without unraveling himself. And the more Nyros sang, the more the god shook, and cracks ran through the sky above, as if it were a mirror refusing its own reflection. And Lorien, seizing the moment, gathered the shards of remembrance and cast them into the valley floor, where they grew into vines of unspoken dreams, which bound Ulthamar's emerging form, slowing his assertion of reality. And Nyros, eyes blazing, took the seed of the silver tree that had sprouted from Velkara's ashes and plunged it into the core of the altar. And from that act sprang the tree of becoming, a twin to the tree of the first word. But where the first word spoke truth, this tree whispered maybes, and its leaves rustled with the dreams of unborn worlds. And Ulthamar roared in agony, not from pain, but from paradox. For he could not exist in a place where becoming was possible. And as the valley shook and time convulsed, and so Nyros and Lorien, bearing the weight of shattered certainties and the spark of new possibility, left behind the trembling, shattered valley, where time had bled and healed again, and ventured eastward into the land without echo, that forbidden stretch of forgotten soil, where even the wind refused to carry sound, a place so ancient and so withdrawn from the touch of reality that not even myths dared linger long in its shadow, for it was here that the gods of silence and song, siblings born of the first pause and the first note, had carved their realm between pulse beats of the world's heart. And here even thoughts whispered rather than roared, and names lost their edges, and memories melted like frost beneath a sunrise no one remembered seeing. And as the two travelers crossed the great threshold, a line not marked by stone or tree, but by the absence of their own reflections, they felt the silence descend like a velvet chain, soft yet inescapable, muting their steps, muffling their minds. And though they moved forward, every part of them was being slowly rewritten into stillness. For in this realm, the god of silence, Thaler, dreamed endlessly of a world without change, a world without noise or friction, where the stillness of now was eternal and unbroken. And the farther they walked, the more their memories blurred, names losing syllables, faces blurring at the edges, until Nyros could no longer recall the shade of his mother's voice or the shape of the tower he once leapt from in youth. And Lorien, clutching the remnants of the truth-blade memory, began to weep silently. For even grief had lost its voice, and it was only by instinct, not remembrance, that they pressed on toward the spire of stillborn harmony, the cathedral fortress where silence and song were said to dwell in endless opposition, neither defeating the other, only circling forever like two hands of a broken clock. And as they arrived at the gate, an arch of living bone that neither opened nor closed, simply ceased to exist as they passed through. They entered a space where time ceased pretending to be linear, and moments collided like rain upon glass. And in that place they were greeted not by guards or priests, but by a symphony of absence, each note a silence shaped into meaning. And from that voiceless chorus emerged Thalor himself, tall and skeletal, his face a smooth mask of porcelain, devoid of mouth or eyes, his cloak stitched from forgotten lullabies. And though he did not speak, Nyros felt his will press inward, commanding surrender, commanding stillness, commanding the end of motion, the end of story, the blessed stasis of silence everlasting. And for a moment, Nyros nearly gave in, for the pain of memory, the sharpness of change, the agony of choice. All these would vanish in the warm embrace of nothing, and Lorien too faltered, stepping forward as if into dreamless sleep. But at that moment, a thread of sound pierced the hush, a single low hum trembling with defiance. And from the shadows opposite Thalor came his sister, Cyriline, goddess of song, her form ever shifting, eyes weeping stardust, voice braided from the notes of unborn universes. And she sang not to overpower Thalor, but to remind, her voice a tapestry of echoes that refused to die, each note dragging forth lost memories like sunken ships from deep oceans. And Nyros gasped as his name returned to him like breath, as the memory of fire, of Velkara, of Ulthamar's fall roared back into his blood. And Lorien gripped memory's hilt, now whole again, reforged by song. And Cyriline said in a voice made of rain and thunder, "If silence wins, no stories remain." And Thalor's mask cracked, not in rage but in mourning, for he too had once sung, long ago, before the first war of words, and now stood broken by the weight of every lie that sound had ever carried. And so the two gods circled one another, ancient, bound by their origin and curse. And they turned to Nyros and Lorien and declared that only one path remained, to journey into the chamber of first silence, where the song and silence had first split from the first sound, and where mortals had never been, and in doing so, bring forth a choice that even gods could not make. For within that chamber lay the seed of meaning, and once planted, it would either sprout into eternal harmony or arouse sound and silence alike, restoring the universe to its first breathless state. And the burden of that choice, terrifying and pure, would fall not upon gods, but upon men who remembered. And so, with no other path but forward, the two descended into the labyrinth beneath song, a spiral of shadow and resonance, where each step was met with a question they'd once asked, and each wall bore carvings of every word they'd spoken in anger or in love. And through this haunted maze they traveled, challenged by voices of those they'd failed, haunted by versions of themselves that might have been, until finally they reached the chamber. As the golden horizon of the nether realms melted into an indigo twilight, and the last echo of the oracle's lament dissolved into the eternal breath of the stars, Aelthar and Nymerian stood hand in hand upon the edge of the veil of all-knowing, their hearts pulsing with the weight of every vision shared, every whisper heard, and every choice yet to come. For the world was no longer a battleground of mortals and forgotten gods, but a vast, living entity shifting with thought, memory, and will, its breath laced with song, sorrow, and the promise of stories not yet written. And as they stepped forward into the next phase of their mythic odyssey, the mists of the twilight archives parted like soft petals, revealing the path of echoed desires, a winding corridor of starlight and memory that rippled underfoot with the dreams of those who had dared to rewrite fate, each echo a chorus, a warning, a plea. or a prophecy trapped in the stone-silver strands of its shimmering walls. And Nymerian, now cloaked in the shadow weave of the oracling flame, reached out with her heart's light, unraveling the truth thorns tangled within her own forgotten timelines, unlocking the latent threads of power seeded in her by the dreaming elders long before the War of the Suns began. While Elthar, his soul now partially entwined with the luminous will of the Worm of Aeons, felt each beat of time as a living drum beneath his skin, pulsing with the agony of aeons lost and the quiet resolve of a warrior whose path is no longer dictated by vengeance, but by restoration. And together they stepped into the central chamber of the archives, a cathedral of thought carved from the bones of fallen constellations, where the scribes of the hollow pen awaited, not as beings, but as sentient silhouettes of pure intent, guardians of the oldest truths who could only be summoned by the unity of passion and remembrance. And as the chamber came alive with the soft hum of unwritten scrolls stirring like wings in the wind, a deep vibration surged beneath them, as though the very archive itself were awakening from a slumber, bound in silence and sacrifice. And from this trembling light rose the glyph of becoming, a sigil that pulsed in the air with impossible complexity, each symbol within it shifting, multiplying, dissolving into meaning and reforming into paradox. And when Nymerian stepped forward to touch it, her body arched with a storm of visions. The rise of the fireborn titans who once taught dragons to sing, the fall of the starlit matriarch who gave her soul to seal the breach of unmaking, the moment she, as a child, once watched her mother whisper to a cracked mirror, holding an echo of the future. And in this infinite cascade of remembrance, she saw herself not as one, but as many, across realms, across choices, each version a vital root in the tree of the now. And Elthar, watching her, felt the pull of her soul across this spectral map, and for the first time understood the full breadth of what they were. Lovers? Yes, but also anchors to a reality fraying under the strain of forgotten truths, unspoken love, and ancient guilt. And when he stepped beside her, touching the glyph with his own heart's resonance, the archive pulsed brighter, and a gateway of woven voice opened in the sky above them, revealing a path not of stars, but of voices, each voice a person whose life had been touched, broken, or healed by their choices. And into this choir they stepped, bodies dissolving into song and reforming in a temple where time had no meaning, only memory, only possibility. And there, they were greeted by the Echo Keeper, a woman whose face was many faces, whose form was a tapestry of all their ancestors, whose eyes wept not tears but tiny clockwork moths that fluttered into the air, each carrying a fragment of lost time. And she spoke not in words, but in rhythm, and her voice was like being wrapped in every lullaby ever sung by a mother in mourning. And she showed them the memory of the split, the moment the world was cleaved in two, not by war, but by doubt, when the first lovers chose to forget one another in order to preserve the universe, and in that forgetting gave rise to the hunger of the Hollow King, the descent of the Moonblood Order, and the silence of the deep choirs. And now, Elthar and Nymerian were being asked to choose, to remember everything, and risk collapsing all versions of reality into one unbearable truth, or to forget again and preserve the fragile balance of multiversal pain. And as their souls wrestled with the unbearable beauty of that choice, the temple began to dissolve, not in destruction, but in surrender, like a memory finally ready to be shared. And they fell, not down, but inward, into the hearth of all flame, a place of pure creation where every spark was a beginning, and every whisper the echo of an unspoken vow. And in this place they saw the true shape of their bond, a spiraling Ouroboros made of flame, water, sorrow, joy. And so it was that Elthar and Nymerian, now bearers of the boundless flame of memory and love, emerged from the hearth of all flame, not reborn, but rewritten, not as mortals or myths, but as conscious fragments of the one song, resonating across every corner of the vast, weeping tapestry of the cosmos, their footsteps echoing not on ground, but through timelines, their shadows cast not by light, but by the gravity of every choice they had dared to remember. And as they stepped beyond the unformed rim of creation, through the threshold known only as the whispering fold, where reality hummed like a harp string stretched between silence and sound, they found themselves in the realm of Mirian, the birthplace of all echoes, a silver sky domain where entire civilizations lived and died in the span of a heartbeat, where ideas took form and dissolved into myth before they could be spoken aloud. And there the skies bloomed with living script, floating glyphs made from emotion and intent, curling like ivy across invisible walls of existence, the one a thread spun by the silent loom of the Mother of Silence herself, whose breath kept the fabric of reality from tearing under the weight of forgotten gods and newborn dreams. And within this place where time was an emotion and memory, a fluid tide, the lovers were led by the subtle pull of a distant melody, no louder than a sigh, but older than war, older than death, older even than the wound of separation that had carved the first chasm between self and soul. And following this melody, they crossed the plains of once, where sand sang beneath their feet with the voices of people who had never been born, where the wind whispered regrets that never found mouths to speak them, and where giant, petrified tears stood like monuments to forgotten decisions, their crystalline forms etched with silent screams and unspoken names. And here they met the keeper of the unshed tear, a blind boy with hair made of feathered ash and eyes that reflected the moment before choice, who offered them a silver thread woven from his own withheld sorrow, and told them to tie it around their hearts, for only with that thread could they pass through the valley of Echo's End without losing themselves to the seductive lies of unchosen lives. And thanking the boy with a kiss upon the brow and a blessing born from their own woven souls, they descended into the valley, where every step they took birthed the ghost of a different self, a Nymerian who chose to rule rather than wander, a hardened Elthar who burned the world instead of saving it, countless variations whispering to them in tones as intimate as breath, each tempting them with the ease of alternate paths, where pain was less, love simpler, war absent, and purpose neatly defined, but holding fast to each other and to the thread tied around their joined hearts. They refused the seduction of simplicity, choosing instead the thorn truth of the path they had walked together, and thus reached the hollow narthex, a chamber of glass bones and soundless bells that marked the final breath before the threshold of the eternal librarium, the great sentient archive of all things that were, might be, or dreamed themselves into being. And at its gates they were met by the librarian, neither man nor woman, neither old nor young, but a presence woven from silence and lightning, who greeted them not with words, but with a story, told not aloud but directly into their hearts. And the story was this. Once, before even the breath of stars, there had been a question, unspoken and unspeakable, that echoed across the void, and that question split into twin forms, a song and a wound, one seeking to understand and the other to forget. And from these two came the first world, the first love, the first betrayal, and everything after was merely a dance between the remembering and the forgetting. And now, after uncountable ages, Elthar and Nymerian had become the living vessels of both. The song and the wound made flesh, choice and consequence bound into one, and so the librarian offered them entrance, not through a door, but through a page, a living parchment made from the skin of time, inked with tears of every being that had ever chosen to live with open hearts. And as they stepped into the page, they were not consumed but expanded, their forms dissolving into rivers of light that flowed through the vast halls of the librarium, each hall a domain of untold truth. And they arrived at last at the book of the first song, resting on an altar of breath and bone, guarded by the mother of silence herself, who appeared as an old woman weaving a tapestry made from threads of her own long-forgotten laughter. And when she looked up at them, her eyes were the void before the first star, and her voice, when it came, was not sound but gravity, pulling the truth into them with impossible weight. And she said only this: to sing the first song, you must first remember the silence before it. And as the new being, the fusion of Elthar and Nymerian, now known in the tongues of the firstborn as Elarian, the songborn, stood at the edge of the restored librarium, with the chords of the first song still vibrating through the very filaments of their being, the universe itself seemed to shift, to realign in reverent response. For the song they sang was not just a melody, but a map, a weaving of all forgotten paths, abandoned truths, and silent pleas left unanswered across the spans of infinite lives. And through it, the sorrow of a trillion souls was given voice, not in agony, but in the fragile beauty of hope, resurrected from ashes older than the stars. And with this song, echoing in fractal resonance across dimensions, layered like petals around the stem of time, Elarian turned their gaze outward, not just through space, but across the wounds etched into existence itself, those hollows where despair nested like birds, feeding on the marrow of the broken-hearted. And one such wound, deep, festering, forgotten by the makers, lay within the ruin-fold expanse, a place untouched by memory, where even echoes dared not linger. And so they flew, not by wing nor by will alone, but as sound incarnate, carried on harmonic currents only audible to those whose hearts had once known the weight of worlds, descending through clouds of stilled time and void tides, thick with unformed thought, until they reached the center of the wound. And there, amidst the bleak stillness, lay a throne of thorns fashioned not from material, but from uncried tears and unsaid apologies. And upon it sat a figure who was both young and ancient, her skin a pale mirror reflecting not light, but truth, her eyes empty yet filled with the vast silence of a heart too long denied its own story. And she was known as the Maiden of the Unlived, daughter of the forgotten spark, the one whose tale was unwritten because it had been deemed too painful, too raw, too honest by the celestial editors who once redacted entire destinies to maintain their illusion of order. And as Elarian approached, their voice still singing the undertones of compassion and defiance, the maiden lifted her face and whispered a name that had never been spoken, a name that was theirs before time dared to call them apart. And in that moment of recognition, the air shattered, the wounds screamed, and reality peeled back like old bark, revealing the raw sap of truth beneath. And they remembered how she had once been part of them, a thread woven into their earliest breath. A love so profound and wild that it had to be erased, lest it undo the carefully balanced cruelty of the old architects. And that memory rushed into them like fire through dry roots, filling every chamber of their heart with ancient joy and bitter grief. And they reached for her, not with hands but with essence, offering her not salvation, but remembrance. For she needed not to be saved, only to be seen, to be known again, to be sung into being as herself, and not a casualty of some god's tidy script. And as they touched, the thorns recoiled, the wound hissed and dissolved into tears, and the maiden stood, her form radiant with stories long denied. And she took Elarian's hand, and together they stepped into the sea of once more, where lost fates drifted like dandelion seeds across the wind of possibility. And there they called the chorus of the broken, those who had been torn from their timelines, erased for loving too deeply, dreaming too wildly, defying too boldly. And one by one, these scattered souls heard the call and returned, walking on waves of memory, their footsteps dissolving regret, until the sea shimmered with the light of restoration. And in the heart of that sea rose an island made from reconciled truths, and on it they built a sanctuary not of stone or star, but of shared breath and mutual knowing, a place where all stories could be held, even the fractured ones, even the ones still screaming. And from this sanctuary, they sent out echoes, not demands, not edicts, but invitations, quiet pulses that reached even into the cold hollows of those who had forgotten how to hope. And in distant corners of the cosmos, seeds stirred. Old warriors laid down their weapons. Long dead lovers reached for each other in dreams. And the Hollow King, still weeping from the revelation of Part 9, found himself not alone. For one of those echoes touched the ember he had buried beneath all his rage, and it sparked, faintly, but real, and he began to hum, uncertainly, a half-remembered lullaby from the days before despair. And so the song spread, not as a weapon, not as a cure, but as a contagion of awakening. And the old architects, those beings of constraint and symmetry, who had once dictated the shape of fate. And so, as the sanctuary's unseen pulse continued to radiate its unbroken rhythm across the forgotten and the fervent alike, stirring the marrow of all sentient threads stitched through time, the world, no, the weave itself, began to remember what it had once suppressed, the primal ache for connection, the truth behind silence, the beauty of imperfection allowed to blossom without judgment. And as Ilarion walked the orchard of truths with the maiden of the unlived, hand in hand through spectral groves where every fruit was a restored destiny and every branch an untangled trauma, they began to feel a pull, a subtle vibration humming beneath the soil of dreams, something ancient yet urgently present. And it was not a threat, nor a plea, but a beckoning, like a long-lost sibling calling from just beyond the veil. And they knew then that while the sanctuary had healed many, there remained one thread, perhaps the most vital of all, still knotted in shadow, buried in a chamber even deeper than regret itself, a place beyond language, where memory curdled into myth and truth wore the mask of madness. And it was there, in the buried vein of the multisong, where the first silence had been locked away, not by gods nor tyrants, but by the people themselves, frightened of what it might reveal. For the first silence was not emptiness, but the raw, undistilled core of being before sound, before thought, before story. And long ago, when the worlds were young and the stars still blinked with uncertainty, this silence had risen once, and it had unmade every lie with such gentleness that even deception itself chose to weep rather than resist. And yet, terrified of truth without armor, the early makers sealed it away, deep in the resonant hollow, beneath the mirrored roots of the cosmos. And they layered distractions and myths upon myths until even the song forgot its birthplace. But now, the pull was clear, and Elarian knew, to truly awaken the weave, to allow the song to breathe, not just in moments of beauty, but in chaos, in heartbreak, in the wreckage of hope. They would have to descend, to find the first silence and bring it not as a weapon nor a cure, but as a companion, a reminder that even the soundless had a part in the melody of all things. And so with the maiden beside them, they stepped into the well of reversed light, descending past layers of memory spun by civilizations that no longer had names, past the tombs of forgotten gods whose only crime was kindness, too fierce for their time, past the archive of breaths never drawn where stillborn galaxies hummed in waiting, until they came upon the gate of withheld knowing, a great door not made of material, but of resistance, built from the collective refusal of all who had ever turned away from their truth. And to open it required no key, only presence, raw, unguarded presence. And so, Elarian stepped forward, their forms shimmering with every story they had carried, and they simply exhaled. And in that breath was no pretense, no performance, just a single, undeniable truth. I am. And the gate melted, not into ruin, but into becoming, flowing into the path ahead like a stream of surrendered denial, revealing the resonant hollow. A space so vast and quiet, it seemed to erase the concept of echo itself. And in its center lay the first silence, coiled like a sleeping serpent of absence, its breath slower than time, its body made of stillness so profound that to look upon it was to feel every unspoken word ever swallowed out of fear, every feeling tucked beneath smiles, every scream muffled by duty. And Elarian stepped closer, not with caution, but with reverence. While the maiden watched, her hand pressed to her heart, her eyes filling with tears not of fear, but of awe. And Elarian knelt before the first silence and placed their forehead to the floor of unbeing, whispering not a song, but the absence of one. A sacred pause, an offering of space, and in that moment the silence stirred, not with noise, but with presence, with awareness so vast it wrapped around the universe and held it like a grieving child. And Elarian did not flinch, did not tremble, but simply remained. And in that sacred stillness, the first silence opened its eyes, and those eyes were voids filled with meaning, with potential, with unbearable tenderness. And the silence spoke, not with words, but with a warmth that filled every fracture in the weave, saying, "You remembered me." And with those three unspoken syllables, the entire cosmos paused, inhaled, and for the first time in eons, it rested, not in sleep, but in being, in the soft miracle of simply existing without needing to prove, to strive, to explain. And as that presence spread, the stars blinked in time with hearts across realms, and even the old architects, now watching from their towers of softened doctrine, bowed, not in submission, but in respect, as the truth they had once hidden was now held gently by all. Beneath the ever-widening arch of the multiverse, where dream stuff curled around old starlight and forgotten vows still shimmered like dust caught in the wake of wandering gods. The breadth of possibility widened as Elarian and the maiden now traversed the endless bridge of becoming, a structure not built but constantly blooming from intention itself, its every step unfurling beneath their feet like a petal drawn from the deepest longing of existence, the dominion of unasked questions, a realm untouched by prophecy, avoided even by the reckless, because to enter was to confront what was never dared to be spoken, what was buried not in time, but in willful dismissal. And as they stepped into that liminal dominion, reality trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation, as the skies above twisted with auroras of abandoned certainties, and below them rose a mist of unsaid names, all coiling into the formless court, where no throne stood, only a mirror that never reflected what one expected. And the air there was thick with half-spoken wishes, and the scent of old intentions that had never been given breath. And it was here that the weft walkers emerged, tall and thin beings woven from the second guesses of all sentient minds, faceless yet shimmering with recognition. Their voices not heard but felt, pressing gently against the skin like wind-bearing memories long buried. And they bowed to Elarian and the maiden not out of reverence, but as acknowledgement, for none passed through their realm without leaving part of themselves behind. And as the pair moved forward, a question formed in the air, not asked aloud but manifesting like dew. What did you abandon to become who you are? And the words wrapped themselves around Elarian's pulse, like a vine, tightening with every heartbeat, demanding no answer but recognition. And from the silence of that moment rose a vision, not crafted from thought, but summoned from the marrow. A younger Elarian, still unformed, standing alone in a field of possibilities, holding a dream they had once thought too fragile to carry. And as they watched, they realized they had placed that dream on a shelf in the corner of their becoming, hoping one day to return, but never daring to believe they could. And beside them, the maiden's eyes shimmered with her own realization, the quiet ache of a love she once denied herself because she believed it would eclipse her destiny. And so, hand in hand, they stepped into the mirror of abandonment, not to reclaim, but to reconcile, to integrate the discarded with the current. And as the mirror rippled, it did not show their faces but the choices unchosen, lives unlived, timelines curled like roots around their feet. And the weft walkers hummed a soundless note that opened the paths, giving them permission to choose again, not in replacement, but in inclusion. And from the reflection stepped forth echoes, alternate selves born from divergence, Elarians, who had become tyrants of light, beggars of darkness, nomads of sorrow, architects of joy, and each one locked eyes with the core Elarian, not with accusation, but with bittersweet welcome. And in that tangled reunion, a singular truth unfolded. Identity was not linear, not solitary, but a constellation of maybes woven by will. And so they embraced, the versions merging not as hierarchy, but as harmony. And the core Elarian emerged brighter, not with light, but with complexity. And the maiden too stood amidst her own echoes, faces of her who had chosen silence, war, peace, solitude. And as she breathed them in, her voice grew layered, her song deepened into something vast. And when they exited the mirror, the bridge behind them closed, not from exclusion, but from completion. and the court of the unasked exhaled, releasing their essence into the stars like seeds carried on the breath of restored wholeness. And ahead now stood the labyrinth of forthcoming, an ever-shifting structure shaped by the future's willingness to be known, its corridors formed from choice itself, ever-changing with every step made. And as they entered, their thoughts began to shape the paths, memories of dreams yet dreamt forming archways and thresholds, while distant echoes of their own voices offered guidance cloaked in riddle and reverie. And deeper still they traveled, passing gates of unborn decisions, crossing bridges built from risks not yet taken, until they reached the core. A chamber not of stone, but of sensation, where time melted into potential, and the very air pulsed with waiting. And within this chamber sat the loom of unraveled tomorrows, a living construct that did not create the future, but invited it to speak, its threads glowing with paths not yet walked. And Ilarion stepped forward and laid a hand upon the loom, feeling not fabric, but emotion, not plans, but presence. And the loom whispered through contact, "To weave forward, one must not lead, but listen." And so they closed their eyes, opened their heart. And so it was that within the ever-breathing silence following the loom's awakening, Ilarion and the maiden emerged into a realm where nothing had names but everything possessed memory, where the air itself trembled with recognition, for this was not a place as much as it was a remembrance of all things that could have been had one dared to dream with open eyes. And here they stood not as figures of flesh, but as echoes etched into the living fabric of potential, their bodies glowing with an inner shimmer of uncounted lives threading through them like stardust seeking reunion. And as they stepped into the uncharted hollow, the space beyond the loom, where time softened and the boundaries between desire and destiny thinned into a trembling mist, they found themselves beneath a sky neither black nor white, but brimming with the iridescent hue of unborn hope, where stars blinked not as distant suns, but as eyes remembering their first awakening. And beneath this sky rose a mountain, not carved of stone, but sculpted from yearning, its peaks wrapped in the wind of questions that had never dared to find voice. And as they climbed, each step summoned a whisper of what could be, of what had almost happened, of the love never confessed, the war never waged, the child never born, the song never sung, until the mountain's breath mingled with theirs, and they were no longer sure if they ascended it or if it rose beneath them, carrying them upward toward its unknowable summit. And along the way they encountered the Ravelborn, creatures of silence with feathers made of shed intentions and eyes that gleamed with the weight of futures forgone, who watched without judgment, who circled but did not speak, for their role was not to guide, but to witness. And as they passed through a valley where each echo formed a doorway, Ilarion paused before one such resonance, a sound like laughter left behind, and stepped through without hesitation, finding himself face to face with a younger self, not weaker, not lesser, but still dreaming, still uncertain, still whole in their untested yearning. And the younger self looked at him and smiled, and said nothing, for words would have only reduced the enormity of the recognition blooming between them. And together they sat in the silence, sharing not knowledge, but presence, until the moment stretched into a braid, and that braid wove itself into the fabric of the path ahead, allowing him to return to the maiden who had been waiting not with worry, but with the kind of stillness only one who understands true becoming can offer. And their hands found each other once more, not as comfort, but as continuation, as the mountain opened into a plateau from which they could see the edges of the next world, a horizon rippling with colors unnamed. And there sat the oracle of all that trembles, neither man nor woman nor creature, but a pulsing awareness coiled around itself, like a serpent of infinite thought, whose voice, when it came, was not sound but pressure in the chest, like the moment before tears or thunder. And it said only this: will you walk forward knowing the path is built by your footsteps, or will you turn back, craving a road already laid? And without speaking, both stepped forward, for they had already chosen long ago. And as they did, the path unraveled before them, not with clarity, but with courage, and the landscape shifted to mirror their resolve, transforming into the fields of sighing mirrors, where each blade of grass reflected not what they were, but what others believed them to be. 1,000 fragments of perception brushing against their ankles, reminding them that every step they took affected countless stories they would never know. And still they moved forward, not faster, but truer and deeper into the field they wandered, until they came upon a tree grown from the spine of a forgotten god, its leaves whispering with the language of stars, and it beckoned them to rest, not with sleep, but with pause. And they sat in its shade, drinking from a spring that bubbled with the sweetness of things once lost and now returned. And as the water passed their lips, their eyes shimmered with the clarity of seeing without needing to understand. And into this calm stepped the maskless child, a being born from all the times they had dared to strip away falsehood, carrying a lantern not made of fire, but of memory. And the child led them without speaking to a doorway formed from the arc of the first heartbeat, ever to echo in creation. And beyond it lay the hearth of the unending story, where a single flame burned, not of fire, but of intention. And the walls pulsed with tales waiting for breath. And it was here they met the scribe who waits, a figure draped in garments made from the parchment of lives half written, whose ink-stained fingers never ceased moving, writing not what was or what will be, but what might become if only dared. And the scribe asked no questions, but offered a seat and a quill. And as they emerged from the realm of unshaped breath, the very marrow of their beings now saturated with formless possibility and the soft ache of truths yet realized, Elarian and the maiden found themselves standing upon a bridge woven not of stone or wood or silver thread, but of the very breath they had surrendered moments before, their exhalations forming a causeway suspended above a chasm so deep that even the stars refused to peer into it, a place not of darkness, but of unsung memory, the graveyard of all stories too painful to speak aloud. And the bridge pulsed faintly with their own heartbeat, reminding them that the only thing keeping them from the abyss below was their willingness to trust in the fragile strength of becoming. And as they walked, the air thickened with the scent of forgotten lullabies and weeping gods. For the chasm beneath was not merely a void, but a repository of all the regrets, the silences, the half-spoken apologies, and the could-have-beens ever offered by the countless souls who had dared to love and fail. And overhead the sky was no longer sky, but a great inverted eye, watching without judgment, without expectation, simply bearing witness to their presence with the patience of galaxies folding in on themselves. and as they crossed, they passed beneath arches of light that sang in frequencies too ancient for mortal ears. Each arch a memory not their own, but still intimately familiar, reminding them that their path was both singular and shared, unique yet stitched into the grand embroidery of all that had ever dreamed of more. And when they reached the far edge of the bridge, the land before them reshaped itself, not in defiance of nature, but in complete surrender to its deepest yearning. Valleys of molten silence, where time dripped like honey into pools of remembrance. Forests where every leaf was a whisper of someone never born. And a horizon stitched with serpents made of sunrises, slithering between the seams of night and day. And from this terrain rose a tower so tall it could not be seen in full, its summit lost in the breast of the sky, a structure carved from the bones of vanished aeons, inscribed with runes too old to be read and too intimate to be forgotten. And before its base waited a figure cloaked in wind, whose voice was not heard but felt, like the tremble before thunder, the press of a lover's hand in darkness, the final breath before confession. And the figure spoke not in words, but in memory, summoning into their minds the image of a woman long dead, whose laughter still echoed in Elarian's blood. And a moment of silence passed between them, not heavy, but reverent, for what was about to begin required the full surrender of all that was once clung to. And then the tower groaned open, like the throat of a creature awakening from a century-long slumber, revealing a staircase spiraling upward into oblivion. And they climbed, each step a question, each landing a memory long buried. A garden overgrown with grief, a battlefield where mercy wept, a room where a boy wept beside a door he could not bring himself to knock upon. And as they ascended, they were not the same people they had been a breath ago, for the tower did not allow stagnation. It consumed illusion, like fire consumes rot, until only what was essential remained. And higher still they went, the air thinning with the weight of expectation, their legs trembling not from exhaustion, but from the unbearable clarity that comes when one realizes they have reached a point from which they cannot return, unchanged. And at the highest chamber, they found a hall of mirrors unlike any ever crafted by mortal hands, each mirror reflecting not their appearance, but their consequences. Visions of what had rippled from each choice, each omission, each forgotten kindness. And they stood in silence, allowing the truth to bloom in their chests, neither ashamed nor proud, only present. And when the final mirror cracked with a sound like a heartbeat breaking, a door opened and poured golden mist into the room, a mist that carried with it voices from the future calling their names not with urgency, but with longing, beckoning them not to save, but to be. And as they stepped through the mist, they entered a realm that had no shape, only emotion. Fields of grief blooming into gardens of joy, rivers of laughter carved through cliffs of sorrow, and every step they took was a brushstroke on the painting of a world still learning how to feel. And it was here, in the cradle of this emotional genesis, that they met the weaver of sorrows, a being clad in robes stitched from every sob ever stifled, whose fingers never ceased their motion, threading together heartbreak and wonder into tapestries that glowed softly beneath their touch. And the weaver paused only to look at them, eyes like twin wells of compassion that had seen too much, yet still chose to care, and without speaking, handed them each a thread, one crimson,